Everybody, welcome to the Duke Forum for Law and Social Change Symposium. I'm Ellison Berryhill. Thank you all for braving the cold to be here today. The Duke Forum for Law and Social Change, each year we pick a topic. Like the journal picks a topic and we write, all the articles are about that topic, and we have the symposium related to that topic. And this year we picked mental health, and that's a fairly broad topic. So you're going to hear a broad group of speeches today. We decided not to narrow it down because we felt like the broadness was what everybody has minds, everybody has a mental health, and it's used in various different ways. So we thought keeping the topic broad was appropriate. So the schedule for today is from 9:45 until 10:45. Professor Allison Robertson will be speaking. From 11 to 12, Professor James Jones will be speaking. And from 12:40, after that, 12 to 12:45, we'll have lunch. And then 12:45 to 1:45, Professor Swanson will be speaking. And the way this is going to work is there's going to be 50 minutes of them talking, and then 10 to 15 minutes of us asking them questions. So while they're speaking, be thinking of questions. We greatly appreciate that. So that's all of my introductory. Sarah's going to come up and introduce our first speaker.
I just wanted to echo my thanks of everyone for coming, especially our wonderful speakers today. We can't wait to hear what you all have to say. So our first speaker of the morning will be Allison Robertson, who is an assistant professor in psychiatry and behavioral services here at Duke. She got her Master of Public Health at Michigan and her PhD at UNC, which is fine since we just beat them. We don't dislike them as much. And today she's going to present on her research on criminal justice involvement among adults with mental illnesses and opportunities for program and policy interventions. So with that, I'd like to welcome Allison Robertson.
Well, good morning, and thanks for coming. So pleased to be here. I am an assistant professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences here at Duke. I'm always pleased to have the opportunity to get outside of psychiatry and come interact with folks at different schools at Duke. Last week I gave a talk at the Sanford School, which was a real pleasure, and so I'm really pleased to be here today too. So I will talk today about the problem of criminal justice involvement among adults with serious mental illness. This is a topic that I've been interested in for several years now. I did my PhD at UNC in the School of Public Health there in, I don't know how much of this you know for having missed my introduction, so please excuse me if I'm repeating myself, but my PhD in the School of Public Health at UNC in health policy and management. At that time, I started working on mental illness and substance abuse services and policy research for my dissertation. When I moved over here to Duke to do my postdoc and work with a group of investigators in the Services Effectiveness Research Program in the Department of Psychiatry, one of my main reasons and interests for coming to Duke here and working with this group was my growing interest at that time in the problem of criminal justice involvement among adults with serious mental illness, which was something that I had become exposed to and learned about as part of my dissertation research. And so I have been working on several studies around that issue for about the last 5 years. So that's what I'll be talking about today. Just to give a quick overview of what I'll cover, I'll go over first kind of the scope and history of the criminal justice mental illness interface, and move from there to talking about a set of risk factors for justice involvement among adults with serious mental illness. From there, I will give a brief overview of a study that our group conducted recently in the last few years, where we tried to estimate the costs associated with justice involvement for this population. And I think it gives a really nice look at the extent and range of involvement in one state's adult population with serious mental illness. From there, and lastly, I'll describe what's called the Sequential Intercept model, which is really a nice framework for identifying the pathway through the criminal justice system, and also the various intercepts along that pathway where there are opportunities to intervene, thinking in particular of the population of adults with serious mental illness, and especially those with co-occurring substance use disorders. Opportunities along that pathway through the justice system to intervene, ideally to get them engaged in community services and diverted away from the justice system. So I'll start first with a little background on the scope of serious mental illness. There are 11 million adults in the United States with serious mental illness, and that accounts for approximately 5% of the population. So in serious mental illness here, I'll largely be describing a series of disorders that that impose great functional impairments on people. Those include bipolar disorder, major depression, the spectrum of schizophrenia disorders are the most common, but really kind of debilitating disorders that keep people from functioning well. So 11 million adults with a serious mental illness in the U.S. We know that SMI is especially prevalent among impoverished adults, so about double the rate of what we see otherwise in the general population, and also among women. So there too, about twice as prevalent among women as it is among men. Among those adults with SMI, a full 25% also have a diagnosable co-occurring substance use disorder, and that compares to about 6.5% of the general population having substance use disorders. So much more representation of substance abuse problems in the SMI population. Sadly, too, nearly 37% of the seriously mentally ill adult population is uninsured, and a full 40% has received no treatment at all. And that 40% accounts for about 4.3 million people. So in terms of the problem of criminal justice involvement in the mentally ill population, we've probably all heard startling and very disturbing stories in the mainstream media of people with mental illness being terribly maltreated and neglected in jails and prisons. We know, have our own stories here in North Carolina. Just about 1 year ago, last March it was, a gentleman named Michael Kerr, who was an inmate in North Carolina state prisons. He was a 54-year-old man with schizoaffective disorder, very mentally ill. He was in isolation for over 30 days, was handcuffed, I believe, for the last 5 days of his life, received no treatment while in seclusion, and probably for a long time leading up till then, and died of dehydration while being transported to Central Prison in Raleigh. There's also, speaking of Central Prison, in 2011, they conducted an internal review of the conditions that adults with serious mental illness and their inmate population face, and the review was scathing. Many inmates with SMI received no treatment at all. Suicidal inmates were left unmonitored. Inmates would, having been left unmonitored, would cut themselves, swallow nails, swallow batteries, shards of utensils in an attempt to hurt themselves. A very serious shortage of medical staff was blamed for failures to maintain medical records, track medications, and respond to calls for help. And inmates were left in what's called therapeutic seclusion or solitary confinement for weeks at a time, often with no clothes or mattresses, in conditions of utter filth. And a more typical case, though, that we see, so those are examples of what I think many people do read about in the mainstream media. A more typical case, though, that represents this problem of mass justice involvement in adults with serious mental illness is somebody who is indeed seriously mentally ill, maybe with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, who is impoverished, no social supports, often homeless, may be arrested for some minor offense. If somebody's homeless, they're high visibility to police and can be arrested for quite minor crimes, trespassing, loitering, disturbing the peace if somebody's in a mental health crisis and psychotic. And these folks often are not able to afford bail, so enter into the system and from there revolve in and out of the justice system in the jails and prisons. So to give a little glimpse at the scope of the problem of justice involvement in this population, there are about 2 million people with SMI in U.S. jail that are booked into U.S. jails each year, and many of them will continue to cycle in and out of the system. About, if you look at the denominator a little differently and think of the full incarcerated population, about 20% of incarcerated adults suffers from a diagnosable serious mental illness, and that's about 15% among male inmates, and interestingly, it's double that among female inmates, so about 30%. Each year, hundreds of thousands of adults are also being released from incarceration, and so that includes people with mental illness. I think it's at least 95% of state prisoners will be released back to the community at some point. And any inmate that's reentering the community faces extraordinary challenges in trying to reintegrate to the community successfully. And so adults with serious mental illness, especially if they're not linked to treatment in the community, are even less likely to do that successfully and avoid recidivating. So to understand, put this in some context, I'll talk a little bit about some larger trends over time that have affected criminal justice and the mental health systems, both in terms of their capacity and cost. So a key historical factor in this story is the process of deinstitutionalization of our public psychiatric hospitals. And that was really about a changing political priorities and ideologies that led to the closure of more than half of our public mental health hospitals. The idea was for people to live in the least restrictive settings possible, and so the idea that we would close the inpatient psychiatric facilities and have those patients instead live in the community with the idea that they could get their treatment needs met in the community and live fuller and more enjoyable lives. The problem there, though, is that the resources didn't materialize as needed to support those community-based services. And that left many of those who had been institutionalized and then at that time released to the community as hospitals closed, left many of them to fend for themselves, often living on the streets with no treatment, no social supports. So the number of persons incarcerated in state and federal prisons has increased dramatically over the same period of time in the last 20 and 30 years. Jails and prisons today have been described as our de facto psychiatric institutions for, at any given time, taking a census of adults with serious mental illness in a local jail, say in Los Angeles County or in Cook County Jail in Chicago. The census of adults with serious mental illness in prison at any given day is higher than those that are in the public treatment service system. And so deinstitutionalization, I've also heard people just refer to it as transinstitutionalization, really with the idea that that adults in this population had moved from public psychiatric hospitals out into the community and then into our jails and prisons. So declining budgets for behavioral health care in states' systems has taken place at this time as well. So between the mid-'80s and 2013, you can see here the decline in mental health and substance abuse services expenditures as a % of total health care expenditures. So a fairly modest but steady decline over those 30 years. And at the same time, we've seen rapid rises in states' spending on corrections, so fivefold increases over 20 years. In this case, an increase of $30 billion. So to what extent does this represent cost shifting strictly between our public mental health systems and criminal justice systems? That is not totally clear. A lot of this cost could potentially be averted by interrupting this population's criminal justice involvement altogether or reducing their recidivism with various interventions and support services and better access to needed mental health services. And this is what those two trends look like on a line graph. So with the decrease in state and county mental hospital beds and corresponding increases in number of persons incarcerated for public order offenses. So are these coincidental trends? No, they're certainly not, but that's also not to suggest that there's a simple and direct causal relationship between these two. We know, first of all, that the population of adults with mental illness and serious mental illness is heterogeneous, as any are. There will be a range of people with various reasons for their having criminal justice involvement and reasons for their offending. There may be, if you think of it as a spectrum, there may be at one end of the spectrum a subset of people who offend strictly by virtue of untreated mental illness and are psychotic, out in the community, arrested for one of these minor offenses, and get into the system. On the other end of the spectrum, you might think of someone who has, in fact, a serious mental illness, but may have other propensities for offending that would have led them to those behaviors regardless of their mental illness. And the rest are going to fall somewhere in between with kind of a complex set of influences to their offending behavior and the extent to which they are engaged in treatment services. And so what I've just described now is an area of interest in mental health research, and that's this idea of criminalization of the mentally ill versus considering criminogenesis as a basis for their offending. There was an early consensus around this idea of a criminalization hypothesis where justice involvement in this population was attributed strictly to untreated psychopathology. It then also assumed that if we could get this particular group of people the treatment services that they need, that would entirely resolve their criminal offending problem. More recently, though, there's been a greater focus in research on addressing and understanding both this population's mental health treatment needs, but also their criminogenic risks that may influence their risks for offending. And that was motivated by a set of different things. So one was that with some large systematic reviews of the literature on treatment interventions for this population, there was seen this trend in which recipients of these interventions had their access to mental health services increased, their mental health functioning increased as a consequence of that for many, but they didn't see corresponding decreases in recidivism among this group. So not the relationship that was expected to see, and this is quite consistent across several types of interventions for the population. There's also another set of research that indicates that offenders with serious mental illness do in fact share many of the same risk factors for offending as their non-mentally ill counterparts. But it's important to, in thinking about the criminalization versus criminogenesis hypotheses, to keep the roles of social, environmental, and political contexts in mind as well. Poverty and inadequate social insurance for the disabled mentally ill is a very serious problem. It's very difficult for adults with SMI to qualify for SSDI and other social insurance benefits, and so often end up homeless and with next to no income. The loss of low-cost housing options for this population has been a serious problem, leading to many of them being at risk for homelessness or in fact homeless chronically. The 3 strikes laws and harsher sentencing for drug crimes certainly has a role in this. The extent to which it does is also not entirely clear, but 1973 Rockefeller laws in New York State mandated long prison sentences for people convicted of a range of felony drug offenses with mandatory minimums of 15 years to life for these non-violent drug crimes. And so in the 20 years that followed, the rest of the states followed suit, imposing these very strict mandatory minimums for drug offenses. And so that has certainly played a part in the rise in the population of incarcerated people in general, but also in particular for this population. In the last several years, I think some states are trying to reverse and making efforts to lower their prison populations and get people out of the system, largely because of unsupportable costs associated with having such enormous populations of inmates. So that kind of complicates the story too. But the generally very high rates of incarceration in the US certainly is going to play a role in thinking about why and how the seriously mentally ill population is entering into the justice system. And we know federal prison populations, I think, have increased by 800% since 1980, and where prison inmate population, I think, has gone from about 330,000 people in 1973 to about 2.3 million people today. So this is a look at what are considered the central 8 risk factors for criminal offending. And the top 4 are related to things around antisocial personality patterns, antisocial behavior, antisocial peers and people that one might associate with, and their attitudes. Some of these others are not surprising. Family and marital dysfunction certainly plays a role in risk for offending. Lack of achievement in education and employment plays a major role. Lack of pro-social leisure activities, and substance abuse. So those are considered the central 8 risk factors for offending. And the big 4 are those first 4 that relate to antisocial behaviors, personality patterns, and associations. Interestingly, though, substance abuse, you'll see, is also one of those central 8 risk factors. And for somebody in my world, substance abuse is also part of a range of psychiatric disorders that we frame as meriting thinking about treating substance abuse rather than it being a risk factor for public safety. So as far as clinical risk factors go in this population of adults with serious mental illness, among those with SMI who are justice involved, at least 75% also have a co-occurring substance use disorder. So compare that, you remember back at the beginning, I mentioned that in the general SMI population, 25% have co-occurring substance abuse. Among those who are justice involved, it's 75%. And that compares to the general population, which is about 6.5%. So the vast majority of justice-involved adults with mental illness also suffer from very serious substance abuse problems. Histories of trauma in childhood or up through ongoing into adulthood are nearly universal in the justice-involved population with mental illness. And so PTSD is highly prevalent also in the community. Personality disorders, especially antisocial personality disorder, is quite common in the justice-involved SMI population, which isn't surprising if you think of those top 4 risk factors for offending related to antisocial personality and behaviors. And then a series of social environmental problems that compound these risks and vulnerabilities. So intimate partner violence, concerns about supporting dependent children, and underemployment are especially common among women in this population. Homelessness, antisocial behavior in associations, and violent victimization among men too. And I'll say, point out that trauma is a big area of interest in this area of research, and I think a lot of focus has been on women being victims of traumatic events, but it's near universal among men too, and they may face different sorts of trauma in their adult lives, but many were also victims of sexual and physical abuse as children as well. So our group did recently some analyses looking at combinations of these clinical risk factors to understand how they might work together to influence somebody's chance for offending. And we looked in particular at primary psychiatric diagnosis in a group of people with either schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. We also looked at the role of gender, so men versus women, and then the presence or absence of substance abuse, knowing that has a big influence on risk for criminal offending. And we found that men with bipolar disorder and substance use disorder had the highest absolute risk for offending in a 2-year period of time. We had data on a population of adults in Connecticut's state Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services had all adult clients in their state public mental health agency, and were able to look at their risk for offending over a 2-year period of time. And symptoms, keep in mind that for those with bipolar disorder, symptoms during manic phases of bipolar disorder rather than depressive phases increased risk for that do increase risk for offending include impulsivity and risk-taking behaviors are very common. And so you could hypothesize that if you add in substance abuse to those manic phases and high risk, and then the increased propensities that men have for offending as compared to women, you'd expect to see some strongly interactive effects there. So we did, but interestingly, we saw that bipolar disorder and substance abuse had especially strong relative influences for women. So adding substance abuse to the spectrum of risk factors for women increased their risk for offending much greater than it had for men. And this is a summary of our results. You'll see, that men had an absolute probability of 0.60 of offending at some time during 2 years. So that's any sort of criminal justice involvement. And for men, you can see that in each of these categories, their risks for offending were higher than women. So again, men with bipolar and substance abuse were at the highest risk. Next were men with schizophrenia and substance abuse. You saw the same patterns for women. But what was so interesting in particular was those relative influences of bipolar disorder and substance abuse for women. So having bipolar disorder for women as compared to substance abuse raised their risk of offending by almost 3 times in a 2-year period of time. But having substance abuse versus not raised their risk over 6 times for some sort of criminal offending during that 2-year period of time. So this work really demonstrated that the risks are different for men and women, and that substance abuse is playing a key role here for all of them. I'll talk now about our study of the costs of criminal justice involvement in Connecticut. And this work was led by my colleague Jeff Swanson. He and I and others at Duke partnered with colleagues of ours in Connecticut at the State Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services and University of Connecticut. And we're interested to describe criminal justice involvement in the SMI population and estimate both utilization and costs for treatment services and criminal justice involvement for the population. So these are the same data that we used for the analyses I just presented. We had we had records for all 25,000+ adults with a serious mental illness who were clients of the public mental health system and had a range of 2 years of data to observe their use of treatment services and criminal justice involvement. It was a merged administrative data set from multiple agencies. The adults in the population must have had a chart diagnosis of either schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And the data that we had came from Department of Public Safety. We had arrest data, Department of Correction, we had jail and prison data, we had probation and parole data, jail diversion program data, and also forensic evaluation and hospitalization data. So getting kind of the full picture of any sort of justice involvement for this group. So our total sample was just over 25,000 people. 27% had some kind of justice involvement in that 2-year period of time, where 73% had none. And this is a look at the distribution of types of involvement among the 27.5% that did have some kind. Arrest was, so these are not mutually exclusive. Somebody could be represented in any number of these categories. Arrest was most common, where 60% of the justice involved had an arrest during those 2 years. Close to 60% had some period of incarceration. Close to 50% had some period that they were on probation. Nearly 30% participated in the state's statewide jail diversion program, which gives people an opportunity to get at arraignment, to get off the prosecution pathway and enter into community treatment instead. And then a small percent on parole. Connecticut doesn't use parole, which is a little unusual. It doesn't use parole as much, but probation more. And then about 10% with forensic evaluations and forensic hospitalization. The average lengths of stay in jail were about 5 months. Probation periods on average 15 months. Parole approximately 10 months. And forensic hospitalizations about 9 months. And so this is a look at the types of arrests, the types of charges that people had when they were arrested during this 2-year period of time. The largest category are these various minor offenses. So that could include trespassing, breach of peace, criminal mischief, prostitution, false statements, lots of technical violations of probation and parole, lots of failures to appear here also. Property crimes were fairly common. About 21% had a property crime. Drug crimes, pretty common, 15% arrested for drug crimes. Violent offenses accounted for 10% of the arrests. And then other crimes against a person, weapons charges, and some miscellaneous felonies made up the remainder. This is a quick summary look at utilization and costs among the justice involved in this population and those who had no justice involvement. So interestingly, which you can't see here, but what I have in front of me is that in the justice involved group, so here, so for anybody who used mental health and substance abuse services is paid by Medicaid. The justice involved group had slightly higher costs than the non-justice involved group. And they were also more likely to use Medicaid services. So 21% of them had at least one Medicaid mental health or substance abuse service use during that period of time, and 15% of those who were not justice involved. And the non-justice involved group were much more likely to have used mental health or substance abuse services in the State Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, so the public mental health system, with also much higher costs associated with those use of services too. Forensic hospitalizations here will only be represented by those with justice involvement. And the forensic hospitalizations are for a time at which somebody has been brought up on charges. They decided that it's warranted to give them a psychiatric evaluation. If they're found incompetent to stand trial at that time, then they'll be sent to one of the state psychiatric hospitals until the time at which their competency can be restored then they go back and step back onto the prosecution pathway. So it's incompetency to stand trial is one very common reason for a forensic hospitalization. And the other is somebody having been found not guilty by reason of insanity and then sent to a psychiatric hospital rather than prison. And this is the range of use of and costs of outpatient services in these groups. Notably, those with justice involvement had lower costs and thereby lower utilization of many of these outpatient mental health and substance abuse services. So including medications, which are usually essential for people in this population, especially those with schizophrenia. Also were far less likely and had far lower costs for mental health services out in the community. They did have higher costs for substance abuse services, but also lower costs for case management services, so suggesting that they're not accessing services as much as their counterparts who had no justice involvement. And this is a table that summarizes the huge amount of work we did to estimate the utilization and costs of a range of treatment services and types of criminal justice involvement among the population. This column is for those with justice involvement, this for those with no justice involvement. Their treatment costs, on average, cost per person that had some treatment was about $29,000. And correspondingly, for those with no justice involvement, their treatment costs were lower, so about $20,000. And then, of course, the justice-involved group had criminal justice costs, about close to $18,000 over 2 years' time, on average per person with justice involvement. The not justice involved had none. And so the justice involved, for them, on average per person, total costs were over twice that of the non-justice involved. I'll say, too, again here, a lot of what's driving their relatively higher treatment costs is the costs related to forensic hospitalizations. So I'll move now to talking about this sequential intercept model, which is a nice depiction of the pathway into and through the criminal justice system and the places along that pathway where there are opportunities to intervene and hopefully, ideally, connect somebody to services in the community and divert them off of the justice pathway. This model was developed by a group of experts at a federally funded Gaines Center, it's called, and their focus since 1995 has been to expand access to community-based services for all adults with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders at all points of contact with the justice system. So you see, the model is pretty straightforward. The first intercept is when somebody's interfacing with law enforcement in the community. From there, if they are arrested, they'll move to intercept 2, where they're in a period of initial detention and have an initial court hearing. From there, if they continue on and on the pathway, they will enter local jails and stay in the court system for disposition of their cases, at which time they either, many will go to jail or prison if they stay in the system. From there, the fourth intercept that's recognized is the time at which people are re-entering the community from jail or prison. And then the fifth intercept is community corrections, and that's for those who have re-entered the community and are placed on probation or parole. This community corrections intercept could also be represented probably in between intercepts 3 and 4, too, or 2 and 3, also for people who are given sentences of probation and not incarcerated. So I'll give some examples now of various types of evidence-based interventions that have been developed to try to get people out of the system and instead into community-based treatment. At this first intercept, the best known intervention there is called crisis intervention training, and that's 40-hour curriculum of training for law enforcement officers to educate them about serious mental illness, to understand the symptoms that somebody presents with when they're in mental health crisis and the police officer is interfacing with them in the community, and also educates the officers on de-escalation techniques in interacting with them at that time, and also making them aware of potential resources in the community that they might take the person to, say, a mental health crisis center rather than arresting them and booking them into the system. That has been, the CIT training has really taken off and is widespread around the country. I think it's not totally clear the extent to which this intervention is being used with fidelity, so with the full training being administered for all officers, but it certainly is really showing up a lot around the country in law enforcement agencies. Mental health first aid is kind of a stripped down version of CIT. I think it's just 8 hours of training and can be used for law enforcement officers, but also any first responders, so EMS, police dispatchers to understand what's going on when a call comes in, probation and parole officers, and even people like clergy and others who are interfacing with somebody in the community who might be in mental health crisis, and giving them some basic training about how they can link them to services in the community rather than taking them to the emergency department or they're being arrested. At the second Intercept, an example of an intervention here is what are called post-booking jail diversion programs. And I've studied this quite a bit. Also in Connecticut, that state has a jail-wide post-booking jail diversion program where people who are arrested and in police holding and then have an initial hearing in court, the jail diversion program has clinicians based in the court itself, and they are working with prosecutors, bail commissioners, public defenders to identify people that may be eligible for the program. If they suspect that they have serious mental illness, they'll be screened and assessed for eligibility, and if they're determined to be eligible for the program and have an interest and willingness to participate, the jail diversion clinicians will work with the court and the judge to arrange a treatment program for that person in the community, and they'll be released to community for that treatment then. And if they adhere to that treatment, all the charges might be dropped or prosecution deferred as long as they continue to engage in treatment successfully in the community. If they decide to discontinue treatment for any reason, then they would just get back onto the prosecution pathway where they were. Mental health courts and drug courts are maybe familiar to some of you. The mental health courts happen a little bit further down the road, often when somebody has a conviction, and those are specialty court dockets where a judge sees only the mental health court cases. But it's really the same idea, where a defendant will be linked to a community treatment plan, and as long as they adhere to that treatment plan, they can avoid jail or prison sentence. Increasingly, I think jail diversion and mental health courts are accepting people with felony charges and convictions too, where in the past it was mostly misdemeanor convictions, knowing that the circumstances around many who have felony convictions or charges may be just as eligible and just as likely to do well and succeed in community treatment as those with misdemeanor charges. So then at the point that somebody's re-entering from jail or prison, there are a variety of interventions to try to increase their chances of succeeding once they re-enter the community. And a key piece of that for people with mental illness is getting them linked to treatment services. So there are prison reentry programs where community-based clinicians do in-reach to the prison in the 6 months leading up to somebody's discharge, trying to arrange a variety of things, including getting their access to treatment services in the community. Getting Medicaid reinstatement is hugely important here too. For any who were eligible and enrolled in Medicaid before they were incarcerated, they will have lost they would have been disenrolled if they are in jail for at least 30 days, I believe it is. So getting their Medicaid reinstated is critical. And that's often sometimes something, too, that somebody may not be able to do on their own and be able to manage that. So Medicaid reinstatement efforts are very important. Outpatient commitment is something also that is, I think, being considered more for use for people as they're reentering from jails and prisons, where I think more traditionally you see outpatient commitment being used for people who have had psychiatric hospitalizations, and when they're coming back to the community from a psychiatric hospitalization, there's interest in using outpatient commitment for those reentering from jail and prison too. And that's really court-ordered treatment for somebody who is at high risk for not engaging in treatment voluntarily. And if they then do not, then they're at risk for an involuntary hospitalization. So it's really the counterpart to inpatient commitment, which is much more familiar to people, but on an outpatient basis. And then the last Intercept, community corrections, are also specialized probation and parole programs for people with mental illness, and in particular with serious mental illness. Standard probation and parole caseloads are enormous, and officers do not have the time or resources to follow each of those probationers or parolees in the way that somebody with more intensive needs, if they have serious mental illness, for them to succeed. And so specialized programs have vastly reduced caseloads for the officers, and so that they can spend more time and efforts with their probationers and parolees with SMI, and also gets them educated about serious mental illness, what the symptoms are, how they will manifest, and what continues to be difficult is managing substance abuse here too. And so anytime somebody has a relapse and a dirty urine, many officers are inclined to violate them and they'll go back to jail or prison. But there are efforts being made to increase understanding of kind of the trajectory of recovery from substance abuse, and knowing that relapse is a part of that clinical process, with efforts to have them be more flexible for relapses and not necessarily violate them right off the base. Outpatient commitment here can be used too. So some key components for intervention success with any of these efforts: systematic screening and assessment using well-validated instruments is critically important, so to not miss people who need specialized services at any point along this pathway. And that includes comprehensive set of services, so not just addressing their mental health treatment needs, but substance abuse treatment needs, knowing that they're likely victims of trauma and need trauma-informed care to succeed, and also have their own criminogenic needs addressed as well. So these also require strong coordination between criminal justice and treatment agencies, which is a big challenge, for there being very distinct philosophical divides between the criminal justice and treatment systems, but also some privacy constraints around protection of personal health information make it difficult for treatment providers in the community to work with providers in jails and prisons to try to optimize treatment and services for inmates to try to get before they're coming back out to the community. And then there's also this big promise for Medicaid expansion that could have a huge impact, positive impact, benefit for this population. This is a map of the status of state Medicaid expansion currently. So with 29 states having adopted expansion, 7 states are under discussion, and 15 states who have not adopted at this time, so that includes North Carolina. But Medicaid expansion extends coverage to all adults at or below 138% of federal poverty line, so affording new eligibility for many adults with serious mental illness, especially those who are justice involved, Insurance coverage will be more likely to cover mental health and substance abuse services, and there are also many initiatives underway as part of Medicaid Expansion and the ACA to address fragmented care for people with chronic conditions. It has been estimated that a third of the incarcerated population is likely to qualify in states that expand. So that's huge. And it's also been estimated that approximately 10% of Medicaid expansion could include people with recent incarcerations. So this could have a huge benefit for justice-involved adults with serious mental illness, of gaining them Medicaid coverage and getting them access to basic mental health and substance abuse treatment services that they may not have had up until then, keeping in mind there's that near 40% with no insurance. Interestingly, though, historically, only 50 to 75% of people who are eligible for Medicaid have enrolled. So it's very important to include outreach efforts to connect people who are eligible, including those who are newly eligible, to the program itself and get them enrolled in Medicaid. So to summarize, the problem of justice involvement among adults with serious mental illness has really been a series of policy, treatment, and human rights failures. Successful program and policy interventions must be evidence-based, well integrated to meet the range of needs that they have, and implemented through innovative and collaborative policies by the public behavioral health and criminal justice systems. There is a lot of work that lies ahead to build the coordination between those two treatment agencies, but I think also big opportunities in the world of mental health services and policy and research to influence those efforts and make positive changes. So I'll stop there and say thank you and take any questions that you have.
Thank you for talking today. I have a question about you listed a number of ways that we could intervene with the criminal justice system, but always on the table is kind of cost. How much are these going to cost? And so which of those do you think would be kind of the most cost efficient, the ones that are most likely to pass that bottom line test?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, not surprisingly, the earlier you can intervene, the more money you'll save. So that might mean in this pathway, CIT, the training for police officers, could avert huge costs by keeping somebody from going further and further into the system. There are barriers to that too, though. 40 hours of training for a law enforcement officer is no joke. I mean, they are strained in their resources, their time. They need to keep people, in service and out on the streets. And so, so there are kind of practical concerns and barriers to better use, I think, of these interventions. But I do think the earlier in the pathway you can intervene, the more money you'd save. Better yet would be intervening before somebody even gets onto this map at all. So intervening, kind of a full prevention model then. But unfortunately, I think that would require, bigger, stronger commitments to appropriating public resources to public mental health and substance abuse services. And until there's really a willingness to do that, I think many of these people's problems won't be solved. For those who are justice involved, and even for those who are not, just any adult with, the population of adults with serious mental illness, whether they have justice involvement or not, are at a huge disadvantage for not having access to well-funded public services. So I'd say the earlier in the pathway, the better, if not even before then. Yeah.
I'm from New York, and I work in the addiction field, and many of my patients suffer from co-occurring disorders. And jail is a major problem for many of the patients. Has any research been done to see if mental illness causes substance abuse as opposed to the vice versa? Because that is a major problem.
It is indeed. And there is, and I think it's there too, the picture is not perfectly clear. I think for some, their substance abuse problem is primary, and their mental health problems follow from that. For others, they may have their fundamental kind of and critical problem is a major psychiatric disorder, and they may self-medicate with substances, and so then over time develop a very serious substance abuse problem too. So it's complicated and hard to know, and I think there are some where substance abuse is primary and others where mental illness is primary. But what's difficult for any of them is that we have not done a good job of integrating care for people with co-occurring disorders. So typically somebody is seen either in the mental health system or in the substance abuse system, and they're not talking to each other, where what people need is more person-centered care, where it's a person with these problems, and the range of their problems and needs to be addressed. So we don't do a good job there either. Yeah.
In the presentation or not, but in terms of kind of intervention and prevention planning, I was wondering what percentage of incarcerated individuals with serious mental health issues are diagnosed before incarceration, and what percentage are diagnosed after?
That's a great question. I don't know offhand. I think from work that we've done in Connecticut, the way our data were constructed, we unfortunately couldn't see temporally when their diagnosis was made. So we couldn't see if they were diagnosed before or after having become involved with the system. I know there certainly are. Many instances, the better job we can do in intervening and screening and assessing people, the more people that'll be picked up who have a serious mental illness, who weren't otherwise diagnosed, who had never engaged in treatment before. So some of that's happening in the justice system. So if a jail diversion program, if somebody's been arrested and is identified at arraignment as having a serious mental health problem, then that's an opportunity to get them into the treatment system. Some are being identified for a first time, I think, while incarcerated, but treatment is generally just awful and not consistent. And even if they get good treatment in jail and prison, there's a good chance that when they reenter the community, unless some coordinated efforts are made to get them linked to community-based services, they reenter from jail or prison to the community and are on their own. No medications. They go cold turkey on psychotropic meds, which is just awful. And unless there were somebody advocating for them to link them to treatment, they're back on their own. So it's not totally clear when that's happening. It'll also depend a lot by age too, right? So if you've got people for whom their major psychiatric disorders are onsetting at in early adulthood, they may be more likely to be identified in the criminal justice system because they're new in their mental illness, and so didn't have as much time and opportunity to get diagnosed by and enter into a community treatment system, where somebody who's older and has had serious mental illness for many years, they're much more likely probably to have already engaged and entered into the public treatment system, and then they have these periods of time where they're going in and out of jail too.
What's the average age that their first arrest is it early 20s, teens? And then also, is there anything special in the juvenile courts that is addressing this issue?
I think there are. I myself don't do any work in the juvenile populations, but of course, I'm aware that it's behavioral health problems are a huge problem in juvenile justice settings too. So I think there are kind of organized, evidence-based treatment interventions that occur in the juvenile justice system too. I'm not as familiar with those. And then as far as average arrest or average age at first arrest, there too, from the work that we've done, our data didn't allow us to identify first arrest because we had a 2-year window of data that we could observe everybody moving through a series of systems and state agencies. So we don't have that arrest history data, but I think it's generally pretty young. And the justice involved, on average, are younger than their counterparts with no justice involvement. But I would suspect it's pretty young. And it's, and again, with serious mental illness often developing in young adulthood and late teenage years, I would expect it to be pretty young.
Thank you.
Yes, Jeff.
I wonder if you could elaborate just a little bit on the role of trauma and violent victimization over the life course in this whole problem of justice involvement, because I was interested to see, you mentioned the finding that history of trauma exposure is almost universal in populations of adults with serious mental illness. But curiously, it's not mentioned as one of the top criminogenic factors that might lead to criminal offending. Right. So do you think maybe that the trauma, particularly violent victimization, say in early life, is a causal factor in something like later violent behavior? Or do you think maybe it's just a correlate, maybe it's just a variable that travels along with all of these other problems? Do you think that it's maybe... so anyway, that was my question.
Yeah, I think it's likely to have an important causal effect in somebody becoming justice involved later in life. I think it also is, those traumatic events are indicative of much larger problems and vulnerabilities that people face in their childhoods and as part of poverty and disadvantage and chaotic and dysfunctional lives and communities that they're coming up in. So I don't know, I can't say what the role of the trauma itself is. I think you could relate, it might be interesting to relate the role of trauma in this population to the role of trauma and PTSD and risk for harm to self or others in a veterans population too. They're likely to be very different sets of circumstances and be different people with different life histories. But each of those groups has exposure to trauma, and then they also have elevated risks for mental health and substance abuse problems. And then thereby they also have elevated risks for hurting themselves or someone else or just running afoul of the law for a variety of reasons, including for substance abuse.
Just a quick follow-up. Do we know whether the rate of victimization is higher in people with mental illness in the justice system than their non-mentally ill counterparts who are just,
I think it is.
Offenders?
Yes, I think it is. It is higher. So reports in several studies really was 99 to 100% reported traumatic life events, either in childhood or as adults, or often both. And that's, again, it's not just women, where I think the focus has largely been, but men too. Maybe they are facing different sorts of violent victimization as adults, men and women do, where women are more likely to be victims of intimate partner violence, say, and men less so. So their victimization events as adults may look different, but I don't think they look very different as children. But yes, it's between 95 and 100%, many 99 to 100% reported traumatic events in this particular population, which is higher than the general inmate population. But there too, it's going to be much higher than general population. Great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we're going to take a little break, and then we'll have our next speaker.
So I think we're going to take a break maybe until